I think there comes a time in every man's life when he realizes that this is where real pleasure is derived from. And it can be all he thinks about, because when this is really good, you just can't get enough of it. In this video, I'm going to be speaking to you about my experiences with two larger than average subwoofers from REL Acoustics. And they've done just that to me. They've had me thinking about this and pretty much nothing else. Behind me is not one, but two REL Acoustics 212BL or Black Label subwoofers. And this is the largest subwoofer in REL Acoustics' new Series S range. And I think there is a clue in the name for what we are dealing with here, because these subwoofers use two 12-inch actively driven, what REL call carbon alloy woofers that are driven by a 1000 watt, what REL call linear Class D amplifier. So I assume a Class D amplifier, but with a linear power supply, which is rare for subwoofers. With two 12-inch passive radiators, one on the rear and one underneath, that you'll hopefully forgive me for not showing you, because weighing over 60 kilograms each, I'm not man enough to pick one up. But I'm sure the bottom passive is the same as the rear, and I can show you that one, of course. And speaking of the same, we have the expected REL amplifier plate with all of the controls and connections we expect. And that means high level and LFE connections and controls. One thing I'm not as familiar with is REL's wireless systems, which is a capability built into the 212 to a degree. You will need to buy an Airship Direct unit that includes a physically large but nicely styled signal transmitter box that sends both high level and LFE wirelessly to a receiver unit that connects directly to the back of the 212BLs. And REL say this is a zero compression, ultra low latency connection. And they left a unit with me just in case I needed to be creative with the subwoofer placement in my room, because wireless will make that easier. But I didn't need to in the end, so I used my trusty REL baseline blue high level cables instead, connected to Eversolo F10 power amplifiers running in bridged mono. Now, before we move on, let me explain something to you briefly. Now, I always do my utmost level best to create videos with high quality visuals that hopefully do justice to the luxury nature of the HiFi products or goods that I'm talking to you about. But whenever something is gloss black, that is about as hard as it gets to do that, because it reflects everything. So I had to be very dramatic with my use of lighting. So I don't know if these shots do the 212 justice, because I think the aesthetic design is very nice, considering we are talking about a big black rectangle box at its core. But I do like how REL have added some niceties here to make these subwoofers more easy on the eye, and I have the best one yet to show you. Now, personally, I'm not a fan of grills. Not the barbecue kind, of course. I love those. I mean, speaker and subwoofer grills. I prefer to see the drivers. I'm a commando all the way kind of guy. Well, I was. REL subwoofers always come with very nicely built grills. So if that is your thing, then I'm sure what I'm calling the stealth grill will be exactly what you want to soften the look of these subwoofers in your home. And I do like the extra details we get, such as the name logo on the top. However, one of the features of the new Series S range is a wood grille option. That is an additional purchase for the 212, but I think they look great in the flesh. The finish quality on them, like the high gloss surrounds, is very high quality, as high as the subwoofers themselves, and the wood slats are all real oak wood, I believe, and they do give the 212BLs a totally different visual vibe in my room that I am a big fan of. But look, I can imagine for many people watching this video already at this point, they've decided that this is a subwoofer just for large systems in large rooms. And I would understand that because that is exactly what I thought myself. And when REL asked me if I'd like to review these because they thought I would really like them, I struggled with the idea at first because I thought they would be massively overkill for my small listening room and medium-sized hi-fi system at best. But that was me totally missing the point of what these subwoofers are all about. Because REL say the 212BL can give you a close to a full line array or 6-pack of subwoofer experience on their own. And as I've listened to a 6-pack of number 32 subwoofers only a week or so ago, this was the perfect time for me to put that claim to the test, somewhat at least. And this is also a great time for me to explain something to you that normally in my reviews, I like to have some kind of comparison to judge a product's quality against. But when we're talking about subwoofers this size and this heavy, it's just not physically possible for me to do that in my home. So everything you're going to hear me say about their performance is me judging them against lots and lots of different subwoofers I've had in this listening room in the last 20 years. And that includes lots from REL themselves. I've had a dual number 31 setup in here before, dual T9X SE, a dual S510. I've had REL classic subwoofers in here and more, and subwoofers from other manufacturers. And I've also spent a lot of time working as a system calibrator. So I've set up lots of subwoofers for lots of people in lots of different rooms. So I do have a ton of experience dealing with subwoofers, but it's still not the same as having a comparison one here at the same time. So do take all of this into account. With the other thing to consider was that all of my testing was using dual 212s as a stereo pair, and also for 2-channel music only, because of course a subwoofer like this could be great for dual purpose use, music and movies, but I think most people will be considering this kind of REL for what they can do for them for music as a very high priority. And for my listening testing, I had to think about how I was going to make these larger subwoofers work in my small room. And it made physical sense to have them positioned outside the speakers and either side of the hi-fi racks. And to my surprise, it was like I measured before I fitted the racks because they actually slotted into that space, in inverted commas, perfectly. And that is because these are actually not that large a subwoofer as you might think. And that is because of their kind of floor footprint space that they maybe don't take up, because they're actually not as wide as a single S850 subwoofer, and that is really interesting. So all of the extra space with the 212s is really in their height and really in their depth, rather than them being kind of wide and chunky. And I actually think that makes them easier to fit or easier to accommodate in probably most rooms, but definitely in my smaller room where like floor footprint is really at a premium. So that was great for me in a way. However, their placement obviously affected where I would position the Revival Audio AGR speakers, and the new position took a little bit of getting used to for the speaker's sound. But overall, this setup ended up working out really great. I will admit I was expecting to struggle with the 212s in here in terms of like their bass output, and that be like overloading of the room, and I like, man, would I be able to even turn them on, barely have them on kind of situation. But that wasn't the case at all. And in fact, I ended up setting them up very similar to how I would maybe a T9X subwoofer in terms of the crossover and in terms of the high level gain. And that is because this new range of subwoofers, the new Series S from REL, they are, and this is going to sound strange, they are the least like subwoofers I've heard to date. Let me explain that better. I think they are the most like speakers sounding subwoofers I've heard to date, just with like a subwoofer amount of gusto, and that is very impressive. But it does catch you out at first, and it did me here, but more so with my first experience with them when I reviewed the S850 a couple of months ago. But now I'm more familiar with this range, I can hopefully explain what they're all about better. Because I said that the S850 was delicate in its bass delivery, which it is, but I actually don't think that was the best or the correct way to describe it to you. So let me try and do better this time. Normally with subwoofers, when you start to turn them up, they start to thicken the sound of music. They start to make music sound a bit thicker and a bit heavier. Even if maybe just by a little bit with the very good ones, you can always hear when you turn them up how they start to thicken the sound, and that then starts to congest the music, congest the soundstage, and it starts to sit itself on the music. And that kind of stops you being able to turn them up. And that is all part of the integration. And you always hear that with all subwoofers to some degree, even if only by a small part. And that was the kind of like the first difference I noticed with the 850, but more so with the 212BL. It's like you can have a very substantial bass sound without the bass being heavy on the music. So you can turn it up more, get more, without it kind of congesting and feeling like it's sitting on the rest of the music. So what I'm saying is normally you can hear some subwoofer-like characteristic sound that is added to the music. And sometimes this is a very pleasurable attribute. And a great example could be REL's classic 98 and 99 subwoofers that add a carpet-like effect of bass that very much wraps around you and fattens out the sound in the whole room in a warming and pleasing kind of way. And I really like that effect, but you are still aware that a subwoofer is doing that, and that is okay. But with the 212BL, I found that with some music, I couldn't even tell that they was playing because there was no thickening or any sign that the subwoofer was playing bass until I turned them off and missed what was now not there. And I found they could deliver a bass that was completely indistinguishable in its delivery from some very good speakers, the Revival Audio AGR. Well, that is until the music calls for more. It calls for more scale, or more drama, or more impact, or more punch, or more scale. All those fun things that subwoofers give us. And then you realise you have two larger subwoofers in the system or in the room, because then you get loads of that, like I said, a very substantial bass sound, but without it feeling heavy on you or heavy in its delivery at all. So I was able to get a very, again, big and substantial bass sound in my room that was very tight and articulate and controlled in the main, even at very loud volumes. And what more could you ask for? Now, do bear in mind two important things. My room is very acoustically treated, and actually the acoustics in here are pretty exceptional for a small room, with a lot of thick bass trapping being used, especially by where I sit, and that matters, of course. And also factor in, I did use the parametric EQ feature in the Eversolo T8 music streamer to reduce hertz by a few dB, because deeper bass is where the room treatment stops being so effective. So some equalization has been essential for me to make the 212s work in here. But I've only needed or wanted a small amount of adjustment here in relative terms. So this is all very important to know. Now, the fact that the 212BLs don't have some kind of EQ system built into them maybe could have been a bummer to me if I was listening to more vinyl, because then I wouldn't have had the EQ feature like I did from digital. Now, that maybe it's going to depend on the turntable setup, the record you listen to, but it is a potential negative for some. Others that are more digital music orientated probably won't care, because, as I say, you can get this really useful feature in a very cost effective, high quality music source like the Eversolo T8. Or maybe none of this will bother you, it just depends on your room, of course. But to explain my experiences a little more, it only took me about an hour to be happy with the crossover and high-level gain settings, so really not long at all to integrate subwoofers. I then listened for around 4 hours to a big variety of different music. And not everything sounded perfect, and not every bass note was perfect, but I think that is an unrealistic expectation for any system, especially when you scale it up this big. But the majority of what I listened to sounded fantastic, which is why I was still sat there 4 hours later, because I was having such a great time. Then my second listening session, I fully expected to, spend the time to tweak the subwoofer's position. And really I was thinking more, I'll change the speaker's position to try and get a better integration, tighten the bass up even more. But 4 hours later, I hadn't done any of that. I just sat there and, listened to a whole load of music again, because again, I was having such a great time. And something really hit on me in that second listening session. And it was because I'd recently been listening to some hi-fi systems with big amplifiers, like some big Macintoshes it was. But I spent a lot of time listening to hi-fi systems with big amplifiers like big Macintoshes or big Griffins. And the reason I think someone would have a larger subwoofer like this. It's similar to the reason why you have a big amplifier in your system. You don't have a big amplifier to listen to music louder. You have a big amplifier so that amplifier is only ever cruising regardless of what the demands of the music are. And it's the same for a larger subwoofer like this. I was pushing it and I was listening to bass heavy music, and the 212BLs were just cruising along. And you can hear that in the sound of a big amplifier, and you can hear that in the sound of a larger subwoofer. It just delivers everything you need it to with a real sense of ease. And that in turn seemed to make my main speakers and amplifiers have an easier time too, which of course they're not, they're doing the exact same thing. So I know that this is just a psychoacoustic effect. However, I could listen louder for longer, and the system seemed to sound quite noticeably smoother with a nicer tonality too, and much more dynamics. And I think most of this is just because the overall balance of sound was better in the room. But the interesting thing is that this was also true for low volume listening as well, because I think when you look at large speakers and large subwoofers, you can think it's all about blasting music out really loud, which is what I do most of the time. But like, not everybody can do that. Not everybody wants that. Sometimes it's about lower volume listening and having like a nice amount of bass. It's actually more important probably for lower volume listening, having that right amount of bass there actually means you probably don't need to turn the music up as loud to get like that feeling, the sense of it. And when it's tight and controlled and articulate too, like I said, like what more can you ask for? Now, I have not been looking to pop my windows listening to Bass I Love You turned up to 11. I mean, I'm not 15 anymore, and I'm sure other subwoofers will do that better if that is what you want. However, I have listened to some quite heavy drum and bass music like Chase and Status Badadan, which sounded the best I've ever heard it. So much scale and impact, it makes you realise what this track is all about. And I have listened to that track on about a £500,000 HiFi system with just speakers, and the experience was nothing like what I got here. You can take a lot away from that. And then I listened through all sorts of music, including some harp and some other audiophile demo tracks, you know, the shit we hate hearing at hi-fi shows, and much more. And all I can say is this is the most excited I've been about having subwoofers here in my system for years. I mean, for years. And I think that also includes the time, a lot of time that I spent with dual REL number 31. So one up, you could look at it in the range. And I think that is because of the difference in the floor footprint. Being slimmer allowed me to position the 212s in a better spot in this room. So I was able to achieve, I'm not going to say a better result, but like a different type of result. And then also the wood grills. Yes, they are expensive and the price is hard to get your head around, especially if you're like me and you normally hate grills on speakers and subwoofers. But these are the only grills, I think, bar the number 31, that I've left on any speaker or subwoofer in this room in the last 20 years. And that is because they make the subwoofer look less like a giant black box in the room. They do add a touch of visual luxury, and that might help you with the WAF, maybe anyway. But do you get a six-pack like experience from the 212BLs as is claimed by REL? Well, comparing to a six-pack of number 32s in a much larger room on a much more expensive hi-fi system is very unrealistic, of course, but it's the best that I can do. Well, look, I can see why REL say that. They say on the website that the design of the 212BLs is to give you some of that, the way they've implemented the cabinet and rear passive radiator. And you do get some of it. You do get some of that sense of like impact and scale and authority of sound in the room. I really like that about subwoofers anyway, but you do seem to get a bit more of it, a bit more of the hype kind of thing going on, and then that sense of like power and ease of bass. There is some of that, but if I'm being truthful, it's not the same experience that you get from a six-pack of 32s that sounds so massive and so weighty and so authority. And I think some of that would be in the setup, because of course a six-pack, it comes with a lot of complexity, more cables, more individual settings to play around with. But I think it's in that, in the capability potential of that, in how you could squeeze maybe more out of a set of, you know, a six-pack of subwoofers. Because the 212BL, yes, you get some of that, but it does still sound like you're listening to one very good, or two, I suppose, very good subwoofers, rather than a line array six-pack. So it's not the same, but I think it gets you closer. And the reason I say that is because normally when I go to Michael's and listen to his 6-pack of 32s. I go there thinking my system sounds great. I've got loads of bass, loads of great bass. Normally it's just from speakers. And I come back and listen again after hearing the 6-pack, and I'm like, man, I've got no bass at all. Where's all the scale and everything gone? Normally it takes me more than a week to adjust back to like real world listening. But if I had the 212 BLs here, I think it would be much, 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 much less, or much, much closer. So take from that what you will. But what about negatives? Well, for me, it would be the same negative that I say for all REL subwoofers below the top two. We still only have manual controls with no remote control, which I think could be super useful on a subwoofer like the 212 because it's taller and the fact that the controls are at the bottom. And if you placed it somewhere difficult with limited space, they might be difficult to get to. And I actually thought that was going to be the case for me. I thought I might have to lay on the floor and try and squeeze my body through the space below the speaker stands to get to the controls. But it wasn't. I could easily kind of reach across, even though I'm only a short guy, I could still reach across, and adjust the control. So that was all fine. But look, it would be easier and more luxurious to sit in your seat and, make the adjustments with a remote control. I've said it before, I'll say it again. And I suppose the other negative for some people might be the price, because the 212 BLs cost £5,499 each. And if you choose to have the wood grill added, well, then the price is £6,048. So they're £549 for each grill. So these are expensive subwoofers depending on how you look at it, because everything is relative. It depends on maybe what speakers you own. And I could see, someone easily dropping £11,000 or £12,000 on a new amplifier to try and get some of the sound that a set of 212s is going to give you. So it's all relative. Now, I do wish the wood grills were included with the 212 BL like they are with the carbon special that costs less. So that is something. However, if you're buying one of these or maybe two of these from a dealer, maybe see if you can get a deal for the wood grills to be included, because if you don't ask, you don't get. So summing up my time with the REL Acoustics 212 BL subwoofers, I'm really going to miss them. I thought there was going to be crazy overkill for me in this space and this room, but they've ended up being probably the perfect subwoofers for me, this space, this room, to match up with the Revival speakers and more. They've ended up being about perfect, and they're probably my favourite. They are, in fact, my favourite subwoofers I've had in this room to date. So I hope this video has been helpful, useful. If you've enjoyed it, please hit the thumbs up button and, of course, subscribe to see more.